With us today are Professor Scott Silliman. For those of you who have not had him in class, he's a professor of national security here at the law school, and also with us are Professor Schroeder, who also, for those who have not had him, teaches, among other things, classes of commerce, administrative law, and environmental law here at the law school. I would like to briefly begin this forum by asking Professor Schroeder and Silliman to get up and sort of give us their general thoughts about yesterday's dramatic events and sort of any thoughts you might have. Following which, I would open the forum up to any questions or comments or concerns anyone here in the room might have concerning yesterday's unspeakable events. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. First of all, I appreciate the fact that you and the Duke Bar Association have put this forum together. I think it's an appropriate time to do so. There is, as all of you know, a great deal of confusion, bad information that you're hearing in the press, and we're at a time when we need to pause and to decide what we do know, what we do not know, and have the patience to wait for good information before we speculate on what will be done. So what I'd like to do is to take but a few minutes of your time and go over some of the things that we do know and offer some of my conclusions. And I then turn it over to Professor Schroeder and asked him to do the same thing, and then with Mark as the moderator, then open it up to any of your questions or comments or concerns. That's the whole purpose of this time. We do know, all of you know, that yesterday terrorists of an unknown ethnicity did strike the symbols of power in this country. The World Trade Center in New York, which represents the heart of our financial district, and the Pentagon in Washington, which is the symbol of our military might, our armed forces. As you know, there were 4 airplanes that were hijacked, 2 American Airlines flights and 2 United flights, and those civilian airliners were used as instruments by the terrorists to wreak havoc and to destroy up to thousands of innocent lives, innocent people all. In my judgment, we've been robbed of any sense of security that we are free from this type of attack within our borders. What is striking to me is the precision and planning that must have gone into this attack. When you consider that the first airplane that was slammed into the World Trade Center hit it, I think it was around 9:15 yesterday morning, and then it was but 18 minutes later that the second airplane came into the second tower. And then less than an hour from that time, the American Airlines flight coming out of Dulles went into the Pentagon. I was just checking with CNN and the news media, and although there are some investigative leads indicating possible ties to a terrorist group sponsored by Osama bin Laden, there is no credible evidence yet. And all of you should remember that in 1995, after the Oklahoma City bombing of the Murrah Federal Building, that there was a John Doe 3 who was arrested when he got off an airplane in the Middle East, and that turned out to be false. So we need to be patient and to wait for all the evidence to come in. But the attack does confirm something that all of us have known for some time, that this country is tremendously vulnerable to a terrorist attack of some manner. Most of the efforts on the part of our government have recently been channeled more towards a chem-bio attack. What we've all known is that anyone can bring into this country in a briefcase, in a bag, biological spores that can cause the deaths of thousands of people. And if you've been reading in the papers, you'll know that the exercises by the government of our federal, state, and local officials have shown that we are just not prepared for such an attack. I truly believe that the attack of yesterday could not, I repeat, could not have been prevented. The way it was orchestrated, using civilian airliners that normally would be expected to be in the airspace between the cities, and the timing of such, that there's nothing that the administration or the armed forces could have done, given the circumstances, to have avoided that disaster. When we look to the future, though, and we look for the tools on how we can deal with terrorism in this country after this tragic event of yesterday, we recognize there are a few things we can do. One, I think many of us believe that if there is a failure anywhere, it is a failure of intelligence. This country has become extremely sophisticated in what we call SIGINT, signals intelligence, the acquisition of those signals and the analysis of those signals by the NSA and the other government agencies. Where we have failed, and we have failed for at least 10 years, is in the development and sustainment of human intelligence. Dealing with folks inside an organization who will give us the information we need. That is not something that this country can do alone. We will have to rely on our allies, and beyond our allies, those countries that we have traditionally not dealt with before. And if there is credible information out there, if there is evidence as far as who the responsible party is, or a sponsoring state in yesterday's attack, it's in somebody's intelligence community, and that's where we need to find it. There's been a lot of emotion and a lot of talk in the media and elsewhere about the response. The response. What will this country do, and when will we do it? There is a rage within me, and I suspect in you, that needs to be vented. We want to do something. I would caution us that until we know exactly who we are dealing with, then any kind of response, whether it be armed forces or less government action, is inappropriate. We did err, as many of you know, in Sudan when we sent cruise missiles into a pharmaceutical plant that we then believed to be making the precursor of VX. Our intelligence was wrong, and the United States has acknowledged that. So we must be precise as far as who we are targeting. I personally believe that if we are to make a statement against terrorism, that we should not do it or attempt to do it unilaterally. That when we respond, as surely we will, we need to have our allies and as many members of the international community with us, either in active participation in a military strike or at least with their consent. And I have been hearing in the news reports that the European Union, NATO, and even Putin in Russia have indicated that they would be willing to support some type of retaliatory action. Now, let me say something about the response. Notwithstanding the fact that the terrorists killed thousands of innocent civilians and targeted those civilians, the United States and the Allies will not. We are a nation under the rule of law. We agree that much of Additional Protocol 1, the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, has become customary international law. We do not target innocent civilians, nor will we. And that needs to be made clear. In an asymmetric attack such as was made against this country yesterday does not mean that we respond in kind, and we will not. But surely there will be a response, and hopefully that response will be an international response to make the most credible statement possible that terrorism will not be supported anywhere in the world. The legal predicate for that response will be self-defense. It's the same predicate we used when we sent cruise missiles into Afghanistan in the training centers, where we then had credible evidence that Osama bin Laden was responsible for the bombings of our U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. That evidence was solid. If, again, we have that evidence, then our response, and hopefully those of our allies that join us, will be in accordance with the rule of law, dealing in self-defense in a proportionate response. As far as long-term effects of what we've gone through, I think all of us agree that there has been a certain loss of innocence in our security in this country. You and I will never feel quite as secure again when we board an airplane or go in a building. But just as happened after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, Congress went to the floor to debate what measures could be taken to change the laws, to change legislation, to give our law enforcement agencies better tools for infiltrating terrorist organizations, roving wiretaps, and the like. And there were some overtures made that would have pushed our civil liberties far too far. Wise minds prevailed. I would expect to see the same thing happen in the next several months on Capitol Hill, and hopefully the same thing will happen. Although you and I will go through more security devices when we board airplanes, we cannot afford to put in jeopardy our fundamental constitutional rights. And I believe we will see that result. I'm going to stop now and invite Professor Schroeder to make some comments, and then under Mark's guidance, we're going to go ahead and open it up to any of your comments and questions. So, Chris?
I'll be brief, since Scott has said many of the things that were on my mind, including expressing his own sense of outrage and grief over what's happened. This September 11th, 2001 will probably be a day as significant in the life of this generation as the Vietnam War was in mine, in the sense that I believe this event, although hopefully a discrete occurrence in the span of really a matter of minutes, is going to impact the way we think about foreign policy, the way we think about intelligence gathering, the way we think about domestic policy for years to come. And I guess the only thing I will expand on just slightly is Scott's last remark about thinking about long-term or structural changes that may result. In our system of frequently divided government and always of separated powers, it's very hard to initiate policy change, and it frequently happens in the wake of some dramatic event. That is just the way the system operates, that we will chug along like a set of tectonic plates rubbing against one another, and then there'll be some cataclysm and the earth will move, and we'll find ourselves in some other place with significant pieces of legislation having been enacted, significant domestic initiatives having been undertaken. And this is one of those occasions when I think in the weeks to come we are going to see many people going down to the floor of the House and the Senate asking for expansions of intelligence gathering capabilities, police surveillance authority, and the like. And I do think that it's important in thinking about the merits of specific proposals to be able to take a step back from the horror of the moment and the felt human need to do something, and to think about the long-term consequences. Because once we put some structural changes in place, those will be then the conditions that are hard to change going down the road. Some of what I think we need to do from an intelligence perspective, we have the legal authority to do. It's a matter of budget priorities and the assignments of assets, which, as Scott said, have been in the recent past tending more and more towards high-tech and instrument surveillance and less development of human assets to do infiltration and other kinds of intelligence gathering that requires human beings to put themselves in dangerous situations. That we can do if we wish to by assigning the dollars to it, and people from both sides of the aisle in both the Senate and the House were raising their hands to agree with the President when he said he's going to ask the Congress for all the money it takes to do the investigations and to increase security. So insofar as dollars are required, I think they will be forthcoming. But we need to think soberly as the weeks proceed about other changes in the relationship between law enforcement and civil liberties. And bear in mind that authorities given away are awfully difficult to pull back or rein back in once we have done that. So let me stop with that and throw it open for your discussion.
Yes, President, probably at this point you're going to open it up for any thoughts, questions anyone might have for either of our two distinguished speakers.
In our response, or any professor that might be able to get his question, under the international legal regime, and in our response, should we, as the UN Charter promotes, submit something to the Security Council before we give some kind of self-defense response to prove that there wasn't imminent danger and that we're going to have a proportionate response, to encourage the rule of law? Do you think that would be a smart policy decision by the United States?
As far as submitting it to the Security Council first, it's not necessary in Article 51, as you know. I truly believe, and I think we're starting to see it today, that this administration, Colin Powell and the other officials in this administration, are already reaching out to the international community and testing the waters as far as would they or would they not be able to participate and consent to participate in some kind of an armed response. Now, Powell has also said, and I agree with this, that if we rely solely on an armed response, a single attack, that's not going to stop terrorism. We are about to start on a very long-term effort to deal with terrorism in this country. To do that effectively, we need the support of the entire international community. I personally do not think that we should go to the Security Council and ask for a resolution which gives us the mandate for the Council to act under Chapter 7. I believe the international community, as NATO did in Kosovo in '99, can act effectively, and with certainly at least the acquiescence of the Security Council. There's no question that Kofi Annan has already made statements on this, condemning the act. This is not a debatable issue. No one is taking the side that the United States has no right to respond, nor is anyone taking the side, albeit maybe a few press releases of parties, the Palestinians, suggesting that this was a justified act. The United States and the world needs to make a statement, and it needs to make it in a variety of manners. A response with armed force, proportional, continued work, as I think both of us agree, on development of human intelligence sources far beyond what we've experienced, and dealing with everything that the United Nations can work with us on, as far as other less coercive type of sanctions that can be applied, especially against countries that harbor and encourage terrorism.
Glenn Wilson.
What can the government do in the next, today and tomorrow and next week before kind of these things come up in Congress and get implemented to kind of ensure some kind of security for people? I mean, supposedly planes started flying at noon time today. Like, what's going to be different today going into buildings or flying on planes that was different yesterday? And for school.
Well, you're going to spend a lot longer time getting from your car to your gate than you used to. Airport security is going to be tightened and taken seriously. I imagine that the allowances on the length of straight edges that you can take through the metal detectors are going to be adjusted, maybe down to 0. The seriousness with which WAN checks are done and the frequency with which bags are opened and inspected when something unusual shows up on the X-ray machine, I think are going to go way up. These were apparently all hijackings that took place without the use of firearms. So the emphasis, I think, is going to be on being even more restrictive in removing from passengers any other instrument that could be used in a threatening way, and those are largely straight edges of one kind or another. We're going to learn even more from how airlines like El Al conduct their security checks and be duplicating them and any of you who have flown overseas know how long it takes to get through some international airports. That, I think, will become more the norm in the United States as well. It also, I think, needs to be said that none of these systems can be absolutely fail-safe. But I think in the short term, there are a variety of operational responses that the FAA can mandate and that local airports and airlines can take on their own initiative as well that will tighten down, close that window of opportunity for people to be able to get on planes with instruments that they then can use to threaten the pilots. There may, in the intermediate term, be beefing up of the substantiality of that door that separates the pilots from the aircraft, which right now is can be breached pretty easily with someone who's of that mind. And the policy about locking the door, separating the pilots from the rest of the plane, may be moved up in time. Now it's frequently the case that you can be taxiing onto the runway and even almost airborne before that door is locked. I suspect we're going to see that the pilots are sealed off much sooner in the boarding process to, again, make them a more secure, make that cockpit more secure than it currently is.
I totally agree, and I think the point to Aaron is to suggest that none of these things, these procedures that Professor Schroeder just mentioned, need any kind of new legislation or any regulation. These are already provided for, even the use of armed marshals on the airplanes. So the important thing, I think, to understand is that starting at 8:43 yesterday morning, the United States government has always been in control of the situation. There was a lot of, I'll be honest, a lot of garbage in the media about how the government was out of control, there was panic in the government. That's just not the case. The President's actions and going first to Shreveport Air Force Base and then Barksdale are all in accordance with specific procedures that have all pre-planned to deal with a situation like this. All the activity as far as the FAA shutting down the airlines is all in a prescribed plan. So everything worked. It's just that we are reacting to the enormity of an attack on this country that we've never dealt with before in our history. And I think what both of us are saying is that what we need to do is to separate the emotion that all of us feel, and it's felt by the President on down, from the tools that we must craft to deal with this type of attack and to preclude a recurrence. The government has the tools now, and we'll look at tools. We really need to try and find out more about what happened on those planes as far as how they gained access to the cockpit area. I am convinced that the terrorists were flying the airplanes. I am absolutely convinced. I have a lot of friends from my old Air Force days, as some of you know, that fly for the airlines, and I will tell you, there's not a pilot that I can think of that's going to allow the aircraft that he's controlling to be used in that manner. I am convinced they were incapacitated. But again, that shows you the sophistication of this operation when you can train terrorists to be able to fly 757s, 767s, and other types of aircraft for that purpose.
I have a question. You mentioned the need for a proportionate armed response, but how can we have a proportionate armed response if we will not get civilians back?
If what?
How can the United States have a proportionate response if we refuse to get civilians?
Well, why would we want to hit civilians anyway?
I'm not
Yeah.
saying we would. I just mean, how are we going to respond in time?
When we talk about proportionality, and some of you know who've either taken Professor Morris's courses or Professor Byers, there are two aspects of proportionality, the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello. What we're talking about here is the measure of proportionality used within the armed force response itself. And what we're saying is that if you're dealing with a singular attack against an individual in this country, then one does not respond with the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That would be improportionate. The amount of damage and the loss of life involved in yesterday morning's attacks would certainly allow for a commanding use of force targeted against those individuals in tactical control over the terrorist organization and the infrastructure of that organization. Now, if we target that, and if you have credible evidence establishing that you have a sponsoring state, then you may take action against the government that is acquiescing or sponsoring it. But just because you're saying that you're taking action against the government does not mean that you're going to target the civilian population of that country. And we will not do that. We will not do that. Now, there will clearly be in any attack, even in Kosovo, even in Belgrade, there is what we call collateral damage, where you try to do whatever you can as precisely as you can, but you cannot avoid some consequential damage that spills out. But the Additional Protocol 1 specifies that any commander, anyone who authorizes the use of force, must weigh that factor before the attack is launched. And if there is an disproportionate amount of damage that would be caused to a non-military target, the attack must be broken off or canceled. I will tell you from experience in the Persian Gulf War in my former life that many of our Air Force planes returned with bombs on board for precisely that reason. And it is important long after we deal with individual battles. If we in this country cannot adhere to the rule of law that is established for us in waging combat, then we have lost more than any potential battle.
Question over there.
Kind of on that note, tagging up on that question, throughout the history of nations and wars and so forth, a lot of times a new power, an opposing power, comes onto the scene precisely by playing outside such rules. Even in our own country, we didn't play by the British rules when we fought the Revolutionary War. How is it that we can, do we honestly think by playing within such rules that we can somehow protect ourselves, especially if we, as Professor Schroeder is saying, want to continue the American way of life with all these civil liberties and pretty porous borders?
There's no inconsistency in complying with the rule of law, the law of war, and protection of our civil liberties, in my judgment. We will never return to a period of jus Romanum. Anything goes. We're not going to do that. The creation of the United Nations, Dunbar knows. The establishment of treaties that regulate the use of armed conflict, starting in 1907 with the Hague Convention, 1907. Especially going to some of the more recent treaties, the 1980 Convention on Conventional Weapons, 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. All these are fairly recent, since World War II. I was participating in a conference up at Newport in August on the ethical and legal lessons learned from the Kosovo operation, NATO's operation in Kosovo, with many very respected international lawyers in attendance. Not one of them suggested that we should retreat. And the baseline is that no matter what type of attack comes against you, asymmetric or conventional warfare, that the rule of law commands that you comply with it, or else you've lost total control over means of combat. So my own experience is that military commanders are trained to use legal advice from attorneys, oftentimes deployed into a theater of operations, and accept that advice in decisions made on what to strike, how much force to use. It is a part of the fabric of the decision-making process of a military commander, and I do not see us returning to something less.
My question is whether that would be adequate, since all those kind of things assume a national framework, and clearly the people that are attacking at this point fall outside of any strictly based national network, even if they are connected by some. They don't have any particular national identity connection, particular piece of land, all those protocols.
You raise a very good point, but again, as far as getting at those individuals with the technology and the amount of force available to not only the United States, but our allies as well, if the intelligence gives us the location of the target, the force will be used in accordance with the rule of law, and it will be more than effective.
Professor?
Yeah, I wonder if both speakers would comment, not so much from a policy point of view, but on the legal environment and the legal restrictions, if any, if the United States decided, rather than a military response, to employ assassination. Leave aside the question of whether we can identify the target. But of course, the Israelis have done this in response to certain terror attacks. There's international law, there's also domestic law on the use of assassination as a tool of foreign policy. How difficult would that be for the United States to make that decision, leaving to one side the wisdom or lack thereof?
I'll comment on a piece of this. As you know, there's been in place since the Daddy Bush administration a presidential directive prohibiting American participation in the planning or execution of an assassination. I have no reason to believe that W is on the verge of changing that, so that whatever the international regime might be in place, we have domestically had one in place that is pretty clear. And as I say, certainly what we know now, I think, would not give anybody in the national security apparatus reason to want to rethink that directive, because we're so early in the game of identifying who the actual perpetrators were, how they amassed their resources, where they were trained, who aided and abetted. And so far I haven't seen anything that would indicate that the existing responses that are available under the current regime of responses in the nature of self-defense would be insufficient. So, short-term, strictly legal answer is none of our organizations that would be capable of doing this are authorized now by law to do it, and I don't see that changing in the near term.
Would the directive have to be revoked publicly, or could it be done by a secret phone?
The latter could be. It's an executive order, 12333. And obviously the President of the United States, whoever that president could be here, could revoke it and need not do so publicly. I don't think we really need to reach that issue. I've got a colleague at the University of Virginia, Bob Turner, who has for a number of years given a lecture on called Sanctioning Regime Elites. And his theory is that why punish the populace of a country? Why don't you just take out the real offender, who's the president, the Pol Pot, the Saddam Hussein? From my point of view, and I think international law supports this, when you are dealing with a political figure who also has control over the armed forces or the instruments, in this case, of a terrorist organization, that individual becomes a legitimate military target. Now, so I don't reach the assassination. I don't reach the 12333 issue. And I think as long as you define that. Now again, as I said earlier in my comments, if you're dealing with a political leader or any individual who does not engage in combatant activities, then you are dealing with assassination. And if you sanction that at the very beginning, the problem as I see it from a policy point of view is who becomes the arbiter of who can be assassinated. You really open up the world for assassination attempts on world leaders. I would never want to get there. So I am certainly content with 12333. I don't think it needs to come into play in this situation. It does not deal with our armed forces dealing in an armed force response. It was, I think as Chris agrees, it was promulgated principally as a result of the investigations that came out of the CIA excesses of the 60s and 70s. And it's been carried on by presidents with a one-word change, and I think that's it. The word political was taken out. But I don't think we've got a problem with assassination.
This is going back to the idea of a military response and the use of force. You mentioned earlier that you felt that the U.S. need not concern itself with contacting the United Nations before a response. Would there then be some sort of concern that this would be acting as almost an armed reprisal for would it then, or would you try to, and I think you hinted at this earlier, instead of doing something which is obviously prohibited, call it under like an anticipatory self-defense to prevent future such terrorist attacks. And I understand that there was some concern the last time we tried the anticipatory self-defense concern. Is that something that you feel is a valid concern on the international community? And how do you think the UN would respond to such actions, particularly in the Security Council?
No, I don't think there would be concern in the Security Council because this case is so clearly meritorious for a response to be made. My point in suggesting that we need not approach the Security Council frontally in this is because, as you know, under Article 51, you need not do it, but as soon as the steps are taken under self-defense, then you turn the matter over to the United Nations Security Council. That's part of 51. But the issue here is that if the administration, as I believe they are doing, gains the support, at least the acquiescence of our allies and the international community, we are not dealing in a secret overture here. I do not believe that when the response comes from a coalition of the United Nations, it's not going to be secret. It will probably be trumpeted just like Security Council Resolution 678 did. As you recall, 678 said to Saddam Hussein, if you do not remove yourself from Kuwait by the 15th of January of 1991, then the United Nations Security Council, acting under Chapter 7, will allow the coalition to use force. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out when that attack was going to come. And the only thing that kept us from the 15th was bad weather. It occurred on the 16th. So I think there's merit in suggesting that the United States and the international community, in responding to this, should perhaps even announce discreetly our intention. If, in fact, it's shown that the Taliban is, in fact, acting as a sanctuary and furthering the terrorist activities of a group, whether it be Osama bin Laden or whatever, then it would make sense to require by public announcement that they turn them over. And if they do not, then indicate that a measure of force will be used. That has been the style used, as you know, by the United States on prior occasions, announcing its particular intention. That will, again, also have the effect of reducing to the minimum any collateral damage or loss of civilian life. So where I differ with you is I do not believe we are required, nor do I think it necessarily appropriate in this case, that we turn the matter over to the Security Council. We would be dealing with basically the same countries in our coordination without having formally to take it to the Security Council.
This question over there.
So does that mean that you're suggesting that the U.S. share all of its intelligence information about these terrorist activities with our allied nations? And if we're talking about the rule of law and you're building a case against the Taliban or Osama bin Laden, and we don't have any sort of ties with the Taliban is not welcome in the UN. They have minimal contacts with everybody. How can you allow them to make an honest defense of their own case? To say we're not really doing this, to respond to the United States intelligence. Obviously the United States intelligence isn't perfect. I mean, the Sudan pharmaceutical company is perfect evidence. Obviously at the time we thought that it was a valid intelligence source. Are we going to come out 20 years down the road and say, oops, I guess they were fighting their own civil war. It wasn't really terrorist attacks that they were supporting.
Well, as you know, there were some news commentators last night when they saw explosions in Kabul who thought it was a United States strike, which obviously was not. It was a part of the continuing internal struggle in Afghanistan. Should the United States share all its intelligence information with its allies? I believe that's probably being done right now. No question in my mind. More so, I think the reverse is true. We are asking for the intelligence communities of our allies, of our friends, to share what information they have. I don't think you would be surprised that there is a global intelligence community that has been in operation for at least a decade, probably going back 15 or 20 years. And the British MI5, MI6 are extremely efficient. we have always used that information. All I'm suggesting is that beyond our traditional international intelligence community, that in this case, we need to reach out further to those countries that we normally have not made overtures to. As to the Taliban, I think the Taliban has already taken steps to announce that it did not have anything to do with this, but more importantly, that Osama bin Laden did not. That the restrictions placed by the Taliban on Osama bin Laden would have kept him from communicating with anyone to have orchestrated an attack of this nature. I don't think we're going to have a problem with the Taliban being isolated and not being able to defend itself. I think the burden is upon the United States and the allies in this case to ensure that we have credible evidence, that's our burden, credible evidence before a response is taken. And I think that's what's being done right now. Attorney General Ashcroft made a similar statement last night as far as in all the assets of the law enforcement and intelligence communities are geared up towards solving this question of who did it and can we prove who they did, that they did it. So I don't expect there to be a problem in the second part of your question.
Well then, that begs the response then, who do you attack? If you're not going to invade their sovereignty, if they're going to defend themselves saying they had no connections with the terrorist attacks, and you want to form a proportional strike or self-defense attack, who and how do you do that? Do you wait till Osama bin Laden or whoever these terrorists are come on tourist vacation to Disney World?
No, there's no concept of self-defense does not mean that you have to comply with Article 2.4 of the Charter. Self-defense is an exception to the prohibition of use of force on the sovereignty of the country, right? Chapter 7, authority of the Security Council, and Article 51, self-defense, are the two recognized exceptions under international law for the use of armed force within the territorial integrity or political independence of a particular country. Again, you raise a good point. The pharmaceutical plant in Sudan, it was not a bad source. The source was good, but the intelligence itself was stale. That's my understanding of talking to folks I know. We must be able to trumpet to the world that we have credible evidence and be able to demonstrate that we have that evidence to support the legal predicate for targeting a particular organization or a number of people or a host country. That is our burden, and I believe we will satisfy it, but it would not be satisfied, will not be satisfied in 8 hours, 10 hours, a couple of days. This is going to take some time. This is going to take some time. And I think that time is well spent. We need to separate the emotion of the events of yesterday from rational, well thought out decision making at all levels of government.
Can I follow up on that a little bit on the timing issue? It strikes me that the timing issue is going to require a development of law and maybe a change of law, depending on how you look at it here. As you've said, it's not going to be a day or two. It's going to be months, it may be more than months, before we have enough evidence to say we know who's done this. And furthermore, we can establish the link to a state actor, if indeed that's what we're going to be doing. So much time will pass that the usual requirements of self-defense will start to blur. It's not as though we follow those planes back to some country and attack. What the line between self-defense and reprisal in this area is going to have to be redefined, because what we're saying is that our reprisal is to defend against some future attack, not some imminent attack. 14 months from now, when we have a military action and response, we won't be able to fulfill the usual traditional requirements of self-defense that we're acting now to forfend against an imminent attack. And so what we'll be saying will be some gray area between reprisal and self-defense. We are responding in a forceful manner in order to deter future attacks of this kind, rather than in order to prevent an imminent current possible attack. I think that here the law is going to change in this area as a result.
I think it will continue to change, Professor Morris. I think it has been changing. I think that we can look at two particular instances of the U.S. use of force. One, 1986, the attack on Libya, Tripoli, which, as many of you know, the United States claimed as part of its response self-defense against the continued threat against the life and safety of American citizens as a result of the bombing of the disco in Germany. And there was, as I recall, at least 5 weeks difference between the bombing and the attack on Tripoli. The same thing occurred with the embassies, 1998, with the attacks on the embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. Again, it was at least a month before the attack was orchestrated against Afghanistan and Sudan. Neither event prompted a condemnation in the Security Council. So we can look at that and saying, is this a part of the developing customary international law of self-defense that shapes Article 51? I totally agree that we are in an area. I think the Israelis are probably the ones that are pushing this envelope of anticipatory self-defense as far as it can go. But we are in an area where there is no clear law, just like assassination, the question we talked about earlier. But I maintain that the United States will, as it has in the past, use as a legal predicate. When you see the presidential statement that accompanies the announcement of the use of force, it will contain self-defense. That is the traditional one that we have used in this type of situation.
I just want to know how come there was no indication beforehand that this was going to happen? Did our intelligence get information that was avoided, that was not listened to, or what happened in that sense? I mean,
it's an excellent question, and a member of Congress yesterday really proclaimed very critically that this was all the fault of the intelligence community and not picking it up. To my knowledge, based on everything I have seen in the media so far, there was no forecasted threat. There was an alleged statement made by Osama bin Laden, if in fact it's proven that he was connected with this, which was a veiled threat of some action. The same accompanied the attack on the USS Cole in October of 2000. There were lots of indications that there would be attack on some naval vessel or airplane in the United States. The problem is isolating it and determining what is a specific threat as against the general tenor of threat. I do not believe, my own judgment is I think we need to wait and look at all the evidence as it unfolds to decide whether there was in fact a failure of the intelligence community. We know that we are structurally weak in human intelligence. We know that. But I maintain that unless we knew of the specific threat of hijacking airplanes, I don't think we could have prevented this. And we did not know of that. To my knowledge, we did not have any kind of a specific focus of terrorist threat, and we knew it beforehand.
what about the global community, though?
I can't answer that question. All I can suggest is I've not seen anything in the media that indicates that any of the intelligence communities that were in contact with the United States intelligence community had noticed in advance of any kind of a specific threat. We are under continuing general threat from terrorism. We know that. But where do you go? What do you do? Again, I think both of us have suggested that the emphasis and the concern has been more on the chem bio. In the chem bio, we have been vitally concerned with dealing with biological threats. Notwithstanding, you read the paper about the developments in the United States deciding to grow a new strain of anthrax as a defense measure, and probably in violation of the 1972 Biological Weapons Treaty. That's been the thrust. We have looked away, albeit temporarily, from this type of attack.
This is a question to some extent follow-up to the assassination question. It seems to me that in order to develop the types of human resources to collect the intelligence and, if necessary, preempt these types of attacks, we're likely going to have to engage in patterns of international behavior that we did during the Cold War, were found highly objectionable in the international community, and which I think as a domestic polity we find highly objectionable today. In other words, dealing with people who are ethically not in accord with their own standards of civil behavior, engaging in perhaps coercive and dealing directly with shadowy characters and shady dealings in target areas, which very often will lead to collateral effects, which will be less than our ethical intent. In the context of the continuing controversy over the School of the Americas, the continuing controversy over our actions in Central America, in Iran, do you think that it is we will be able to, in the international environment, as a domestic environment, to engage in those types of behaviors, those types of activities, to really develop a truly effective intelligence and human preemptive apparatus around the world?
It's an excellent point, and I'm going to invite Professor Schroeder to comment on that too, if you will. The answer is yes, I believe we can. The difference between the situation we're dealing with now in developing and sustaining and furthering a good human intelligence network, which I totally agree deals with very unsavory characters, and you spend a lot of your taxpayers' money and mine to develop those contexts. The difference between now and the late 60s and very early 70s is the fact that we have oversight committees in Congress to watch over that. We have the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, we've got the House Permanent Committee on Intelligence, and there is a lot of regulation of the intelligence community, and as we mentioned, 12333 came out of that too. So there's been a lot of response. I do not feel that the legislation we have in place, which I totally agree with, will in any way hamper us from working with our allies to develop the type of human intelligence that we greatly need to deal with a terrorist threat. Signals intelligence and satellite imagery is not going to do you a whole lot of good in dealing with this type of asymmetric threat. But yeah, we're going to deal with unsavory characters, and a lot of times we'll deal with them through third parties. But I don't think that we're going to be involved in the School of the Americas type of thing, which is an issue I'm not sure. I think they got kind of a bad rap in some respects, but I don't think we'll ever go there.
Let's have a few more questions in back.
Generally, in times of crisis like this, there tends to be a move toward focusing on federal government, on being centralized, moving away from states' rights. Do you think that that is going to happen in this case?
Well, I think this is one of the kinds of problems that is in the unique competence of the federal government to address. And I would doubt that even the most, I would doubt that many who strongly support devolution of authority to state governments on environmental programs or welfare administration or education or so on will be very resistant to the notion that the only government entity capable of addressing the intelligence and security aspects of this problem in a truly integrated way is going to be the federal government. So, yes, it's going to be dealt with at the central level, but I don't think that's going to be viewed as a sucking away of power from the states that are legitimately theirs, because I think this is the kind of problem that almost everybody considers to be uniquely within the province of the government in Washington.
You want to respond to another question about intelligence?
Oh, the dealing with unsavory characters. Yes, a very profound question, and multi-leveled. I think point one is getting at these cells is, if they are cells of terrorists, is incredibly difficult because of the way they're structured. Even if you are in the business of using a lot of human assets, it's a very difficult thing to do. And it is also the case that it gets you into the business of dealing with people that you wouldn't bring home to dinner with your mother and father. And there are lots of historical examples of us having to deal with organizations and individuals who, by their own right, look to be dictatorial, anti-democratic, vicious, but because they're situated in a position to provide us some information or to be a counterweight to something we view as even more dictatorial or vicious, we find ourselves collaborating. National security makes strange bedfellows. This is the lesson of that, and that's a difficult problem. That's a difficult people can disagree about whether it's right or wrong to do that. Good Catholics in the crowd will know that the doctrine of double effect. If you intend the good, but the act results in some bad, are you responsible for that or absolved from that? That's a profound problem and a profound question. Will it get us in trouble internationally? I think depends to a very heavy extent on the degree to which fighting terrorism becomes a priority of a large part of the international community. We've paid a lot of lip service to fighting terrorism. At the same time, democracies and other countries do a lot of business with countries who we believe are state sponsors of terrorism, and we seem to, at an economic level, get along fine with lots of countries that we believe are harboring individuals who then perpetrate acts of death and destruction. Is that going to continue, or is this going to, in part, move the international community to take an even more aggressive stand against terrorist activities and against state sponsors of terrorism? To the extent that movement occurs, I think will be importantly determinative of the extent to which using more intrusive intelligence and other kinds of techniques becomes viewed as more appropriate given the exigent circumstances. One could speculate where we'll be if this happens a second time in the near term, about America's resolve to respond to these problems. But I think the international response is not something entirely within our control, although we're going to have a lot of effect over it by the way we do diplomacy in the next months and years ahead.
Take a few more questions. Nick? Anyone? One more question.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what would it take to pursue this as a law enforcement rather than a military matter, and what would be the legal basis for doing that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I do think you want to distinguish between the individuals who were causally responsible for the bombings and the people who aided and abetted them in an immediate causal sense, and potentially as yet unknown state sponsors of the organizations. I would think that our first response with respect to individuals who are in the first category, aiders and abettors or participants in this conspiracy, is going to be to try to bring those people to justice in a court of law by perhaps extracting them from some location. Not going in with the intention of using heavy military force to assassinate people before they've been tried. The state sponsor business raises an entirely different set of issues. What do you do with, you know, the hypothetical rogue state? And I think if it comes to the point of the president concluding that a nation state was heavily responsible or heavily involved in making it possible that this organization could perpetrate these acts, that's when you confront the issue of what is a measured or proportionate military response. But I would think, and I hope and I think and believe, that we're not going to approach the issue of trying to do justice in this circumstance by unilaterally going after individuals involved and killing them, if we can do it some other way. That the first choice is going to be to try to get them to some tribunal where they can be tried in a court of law.
I totally agree, and I think that also applies that if it's ever shown that there was some kind of complicity by people in this country, we would take the same approach that we did for the first World Trade Center bombing in '93 when we had the trial. I think we differentiate between state sponsorship and also an organization, multi-headed organization such as been described and we think may have been involved in this. So I think we're pursuing both remedies at the same time. I think all of us agree that there's no single response on the part of the United States or the international community which is going to be successful in solving the problem of terrorism. It's a long-term, multifaceted response which must be used.
The last question over there.
If we were able, just hypothetically, to determine that the actors that hijacked the planes were in fact employees of a foreign government or military personnel of a foreign government, then it would be straightforward. It would be a military attack on our sovereign country. What would be the legal and appropriate response then?
You recall that when there was the assassination attempt against the senior President Bush, that there was an armed force used against the intelligence community of Iraq. There is a case that students from my class have just covered called the Nagel case. It's a dated case, but nonetheless it's normally the one cited as authority for the United States to use force in defense of the lives and safety of its citizens abroad. So I don't think there's I don't think there's going to be a real issue as far as determining the legitimacy of the use of armed force in that type of situation, either under domestic or international law.
But what would be the extent of what would be a legitimate response? What would be the extent of the response?
Well, that's where we get into this proportional response issue, and it's very hard to, it is not a one versus one dynamic that you deal with. It's a lot more complex than that, and it deals with all the considerations. But the current status of law, both the positive law and international, customary international law, both require those that make the decision to use force to apply the principles of law before the decision is made. Before the decision is made.
First, ask both of you guys about closing thoughts in general about anything you might want to offer.
Just that I've appreciated the discussion, both as much to hear from you as to hear myself talk, and will be happy to speak to any of you individually or collectively if you have questions about what's going on in response to yesterday's events as the days ahead proceed. So stop by and see me if the mood suits you, and if you're curious about something, I'll try to be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Again, as I opened with, I want to specifically thank Mark and Amy and the Duke Bar Association for putting this thing together for all our benefits. I think we've got to move beyond the hurt and the pain and the rage which we all feel. And in dealing with these issues and asking the very pertinent questions which all of you have today, we've got to recognize that the rule of law will obtain in any response. It must obtain. We are a people under law. We value the protection of the law. And if we have that value, then we must recognize that it extends to how we respond even in the most difficult of times. And that is that time now. I share Professor Schroeder's invitation. My office is upstairs. I invite any of you who want to talk about this to stop up at any time. There needs to be an airing of a lot of your concerns and a lot of your questions. The worst thing that can happen is for there to be an ill-informed public. We need to know what we're dealing with, and again, what we're not aware of yet. We need to be patient for all the evidence to come in. Mark?
I would like to thank our two distinguished speakers for their time and effort in this time. I'd also like to remind everyone that if you've not done so already, you can give blood in the Bryan Center today, tomorrow, and Thursday, I do believe, and just in general to keep in your minds and thoughts and prayers all those families and friends who have been affected by this unfortunate turn of events. Thank you.